They never tell you this in school. They tell you dates, they tell you victories, they tell you names carved in marble. But they never tell you what it cost to build a nation that would one day call itself the most powerful country on earth. Before America was a flag, before it was an idea, before it was a promise whispered to the tired and the poor, it was a gamble made by desperate men, frightened women, enslaved souls, and dreamers who did not yet know how much blood the dream would demand. On a cold morning in December 1606, three small ships cut through the dark Atlantic waters. The Susan Constant, the Godspeed, and the Discovery carried 104 passengers who believed, some blindly, some greedily, that history was waiting for them on the other side of the ocean. What none of them understood was this: America was not waiting to be discovered. America was waiting to test them. Storms battered the ships for weeks. Men prayed, cursed, vomited, and died before ever seeing land. Food rotted, fresh water turned foul, hope thinned with every passing day. Yet somewhere in that endless gray horizon, an invisible future was forming, one that would shape the lives of millions yet unborn. When they finally reached the shores of what would become Virginia, they named their settlement Jamestown, after a king who would never see it and never truly care for the men who would die there. Within months, starvation took hold. Men ate rats, then dogs, then leather, then the unthinkable. The winter of 1609 would later be remembered as the starving time, a season so brutal that it stripped away the illusion of civilization and revealed something raw and terrifying about survival. Bodies were buried shallowly, some were dug back up. This was the soil in which America was planted. Not freedom, not equality, but hunger, fear, and endurance. And yet, somehow, it survived. From these broken beginnings rose a society fueled by contradiction, preaching liberty while practicing slavery, demanding independence while destroying native worlds, promising opportunity while denying humanity to millions. Every generation that followed would inherit this tension. The settlers who clashed with Native American tribes over land could not imagine that one day their descendants would stretch from ocean to ocean, displacing entire civilizations in the name of destiny. The enslaved Africans forced onto plantations could not know that their suffering would become the central moral wound of the nation, a wound that would one day tear the country in two. And the revolutionaries who would later cry out for freedom from British rule could not yet see that their victory would raise a question America has never fully answered. Who, exactly, is freedom for? The story of the United States is not a straight line toward greatness. It is a violent, painful, extraordinary struggle between ideals and reality. It is the story of people who believed in something larger than themselves, and people who used that belief to justify cruelty. It is the story of hope rising again and again from the ashes of failure. And it begins here, with a fragile settlement clinging to life on the edge of a vast, unforgiving continent. America did not begin as a miracle. America began as a test. And the test had only just begun.
The land did not welcome them. It watched them. Forests stretched endlessly, dense and alive, filled with sounds the settlers could not name and dangers they could not see. Rivers moved with quiet authority, carrying secrets older than any European crown. And everywhere, unseen at first but always present, were the people who had lived on this land for thousands of years. To the Powhatan Confederacy, the arrival of the English was not destiny, it was intrusion. At first there was cautious curiosity. Trade followed fear. Corn was exchanged for metal tools. Words were shared, often misunderstood. But beneath every interaction lay an unspoken truth. Both sides knew this fragile balance would not last. Captain John Smith liked to believe he understood this new world. He wrote of bravery and leadership, of diplomacy and adventure. He told stories, some true, some carefully shaped, about his encounters with Powhatan leaders and a young girl named Pocahontas. History would later romanticize these moments, painting them in soft colors of friendship and rescue. Reality was harsher. Pocahontas was a child. Power was always unequal, and peace was temporary. As Jamestown struggled to survive, another force was taking root, one far more influential than any treaty or tale: tobacco. When John Rolfe discovered that tobacco could be grown profitably in Virginia, everything changed. The crop transformed the colony from a failing experiment into a commercial enterprise. Fields expanded, land became valuable, and suddenly coexistence with native tribes became inconvenient. More land meant more conflict. Villages were burned, crops destroyed. Retaliation followed retaliation until violence became routine. To the English settlers, expansion was survival. To the Native Americans, it was erasure. By the 1620s, Jamestown was no longer merely clinging to life, it was growing, and growth demanded labor. At first, that labor came from indentured servants, poor Europeans who traded years of their lives for passage across the Atlantic. Many would never live to see freedom. Disease, punishment, and exhaustion claimed them early. But indentured servitude had a problem. It ended. In 1619, a Dutch ship arrived in Virginia carrying around 20 Africans. Their legal status was unclear. They were not yet slaves in the rigid sense history would later define, but they were not free either. They were property in all but name. Few noticed the moment. Fewer still understood its significance. But this quiet transaction marked the beginning of a system that would shape America more deeply than any war or constitution. Slavery did not begin with chains. It began with convenience. As tobacco profits grew, plantation owners sought a labor force that would never gain freedom, never claim land, never demand rights. Over time, laws hardened. Skin color became destiny. Humanity was rewritten into property. By the mid-1600s, slavery was no longer an accident of circumstance, it was a foundation. And while Virginia expanded south and west, something different was happening to the north. In 1620, another group crossed the Atlantic, carrying not dreams of profit, but visions of purity. The Pilgrims, aboard the Mayflower, sought religious freedom, but not the freedom of others. They wanted the right to build a society shaped entirely by their beliefs. Before stepping onto land, they signed the Mayflower Compact, a simple agreement, but a revolutionary one. It declared that authority came not solely from kings, but from the consent of the governed. This idea, fragile and limited as it was, would echo through American history. Yet even here, contradiction ruled. The Puritans fled persecution only to become persecutors themselves. Dissenters were banished. Beliefs were policed. Fear of moral decay shaped every law, every punishment. In New England, communities were tight, disciplined, and unforgiving. Survival depended on obedience. Individual freedom was secondary to collective order. By the late 1600s, the American colonies were no longer isolated experiments. They were societies, uneven, unstable, deeply divided. To the south, wealth built on slavery and export crops. To the north, communities bound by faith, trade, and education. Between them, countless native nations being pushed, broken, or erased. And far across the ocean, the British Crown watched closely. At first, England paid little attention.
The colonies were distant, difficult, and often disappointing. But as profits grew, so did interest. Taxes followed trade, laws followed taxes, control followed laws. What the colonists did not yet realize was this: they were learning how to govern themselves. Local assemblies debated laws, town meetings shaped communities. People grew accustomed to having a voice, even if that voice belonged only to white men of property. Slowly, subtly, an identity began to form. Not English, not fully American, something new. By the early 1700s, the colonies were thriving, but they were also restless. They had tasted autonomy. They had built lives in a land that felt like theirs, not England's. And when Britain would later try to tighten its grip, it would discover something dangerous had already taken root: an expectation. The expectation that power could be questioned, that authority could be resisted, that a distant king might not deserve obedience. The stage was being set, not for peace, but for rebellion. And when the spark finally came, it would ignite more than a war. It would ignite an idea powerful enough to change the world.
The spark did not come all at once. It crept in quietly, disguised as paperwork, stamps, signatures, and laws written an ocean away by men who would never walk American soil. For decades, the British Empire had allowed its colonies a remarkable degree of freedom. As long as tobacco flowed, ships sailed, and profits returned to London, colonial life was largely left alone. This period, later called salutary neglect, was not born of kindness. It was born of distance and distraction. But empires are expensive. By the mid-1700s, Britain was locked in a global struggle for dominance. The French and Indian War, known in Europe as the 7 Years' War, would decide who controlled North America. Colonists fought alongside British soldiers, bleeding in forests and fields they already called home. When the war ended in 1763, Britain stood victorious and deeply in debt. The solution from London's perspective was obvious: make the colonies pay. The first new law arrived like a warning shot: the Sugar Act. It tightened customs enforcement and taxed goods colonists relied on daily. Merchants grumbled, but life went on. Then came the Stamp Act. Every legal document, newspaper, license, and contract now required an official stamp purchased from the British government. It was not the amount that enraged the colonies, it was the principle. For the first time, Britain was directly taxing them without their consent. The phrase began to circulate in taverns, meeting halls, and whispered conversations. No taxation without representation. It was more than a slogan. It was a challenge to authority itself. Protests erupted. Effigies were burned. Tax collectors were threatened, beaten, sometimes forced to resign. Colonial assemblies passed resolutions declaring the act illegitimate. Britain was shocked. These were not the actions of obedient subjects. These were the actions of people who believed they had rights. When Parliament repealed the Stamp Act, it believed it had restored order. But in the same breath, it passed the Declaratory Act, asserting its absolute authority over the colonies in all cases whatsoever. The message was clear: obey or else. The else came soon. Townshend Acts, new taxes, new enforcement, British troops stationed in colonial cities, not to defend them, but to control them. In Boston, tension simmered like a wound that refused to heal. Soldiers and civilians clashed regularly. Insults turned into shoves, shoves into blows. On a cold night in March 1770, that tension exploded. A small crowd gathered, taunting British soldiers. Snowballs flew. Someone rang a bell. Reinforcements arrived. Confusion spread. Then a shot rang out. Then another. When the smoke cleared, 5 colonists lay dead. History would remember it as the Boston Massacre. To the British, it was a tragic misunderstanding. To the colonists, it was proof of tyranny. Paul Revere's engraving spread the story far beyond Boston, exaggerating details, sharpening anger, transforming fear into unity. Words became weapons. Pamphlets flooded the colonies. Newspapers carried fiery editorials. Men like Samuel Adams understood something vital. A revolution begins not with bullets, but with belief. Still, many colonists hesitated. They were angry, but not yet rebellious. Independence was a radical thought, one that threatened everything they knew. Britain, convinced force would restore obedience, made another mistake. The Tea Act of 1773 was designed to save the struggling East India Company. It lowered the price of tea, but maintained the tax. To Britain, it was practical. To the colonists, it was a trap. On a December night, men disguised as Mohawk warriors boarded ships in Boston Harbor and dumped 342 chests of tea into the icy water. No theft, no violence, only defiance. The Boston Tea Party was a statement, and Britain answered it with punishment. Ports were closed, self-government was suspended, troops arrived in greater numbers, Massachusetts was placed under near-military rule. Colonists across the 13 colonies watched carefully. If Britain could crush Boston, it could crush them all. Committees of correspondence spread information and coordination. Colonial leaders met secretly, militias trained quietly. The divide was now clear. Loyalists believed rebellion would bring ruin. Patriots believed obedience would bring chains. In April 1775, British troops marched toward Concord to seize colonial weapons. They never made it quietly. At Lexington, someone fired a shot. No one knows who, but the sound echoed across history. By the time the smoke cleared, the British were retreating, harassed by farmers and shopkeepers who fought not as soldiers, but as citizens defending something they had not fully defined. War had begun, and with it came a question more dangerous than any army. Could a group of colonies, divided by geography, culture, and class, stand against the greatest empire on earth? As battles spread, so did doubt. Supplies were scarce, training was poor, leadership was uncertain. Then, in the winter of 1776, a thin pamphlet appeared. It was called Common Sense. Written by Paine, it spoke in plain language, stripped of ceremony and fear. It asked what few dared to ask openly. Why should an island rule a continent? Why should a king inherit power at birth? Why should loyalty outweigh justice? The pamphlet sold hundreds of thousands of copies, and something shifted. Independence was no longer unthinkable. It was inevitable. By July 1776, colonial leaders gathered in Philadelphia, knowing full well that what they were about to do could cost them everything. They debated, they argued, they hesitated. Then they signed. The Declaration of Independence was not merely a document, it was a confession and a threat. A confession that they were no longer subjects, a threat that they would fight for that truth. When the ink dried, they were traitors to the crown, and there would be no turning back. The war for independence had begun. But winning a war is one thing. Building a nation is something far more dangerous.
They declared independence with brave words. They fought for it with uncertainty, hunger, and fear. The Declaration of Independence did not end the war, it transformed it. What had begun as resistance was now rebellion. Every signer understood the risk. If they failed, they would be hanged as traitors. If they succeeded, they would attempt something the world had never seen before. An empire defeated not by another empire, but by its own colonies. The early months of the war offered little reason for hope. The British Army was disciplined, experienced, and powerful. Its navy ruled the seas. The Continental Army, by contrast, was a fragile collection of farmers, laborers, and volunteers led by officers still learning what command truly meant. George Washington understood this better than anyone. He was not a brilliant tactician in the traditional sense, but he possessed something more valuable: endurance. He knew he did not need to win every battle. He only needed to avoid losing the war. In the winter of 1776, after a series of crushing defeats, Washington faced collapse. Morale was gone, enlistments were expiring, desertion was rising. Then, on Christmas night, he made a desperate gamble. Under cover of darkness and a brutal storm, Washington led his troops across the icy Delaware River. Many lacked boots. Blood marked the snow. Some soldiers could barely stand. At dawn, they struck the Hessian garrison at Trenton. The victory was small in scale, but enormous in meaning. It proved the Continental Army could still fight. Hope, once nearly extinguished, flickered back to life. But hope alone could not defeat Britain. As the war dragged on, the colonies struggled with shortages of food, weapons, and money. Inflation soared. Civilians suffered. Loyalists were harassed, driven from homes, sometimes executed. Revolution, it turned out, was not clean. The war divided families, towns, and churches. Freedom came at a cost, paid not only in blood, but in trust. Everything changed in 1777 at Saratoga. There, American forces achieved a decisive victory over British General John Burgoyne. It was more than a battlefield success. It was a message to the world. The colonies could win. France, long eager to weaken Britain, saw its opportunity. Secret support became open alliance. Ships, soldiers, weapons, and money flowed across the Atlantic. The war was no longer colonial. It was global. With French help, the balance slowly shifted, yet victory remained uncertain. British forces captured cities. Washington endured another brutal winter at Valley Forge, where disease and starvation killed more men than enemy fire. And yet the army survived. Training improved, discipline hardened, loyalty deepened. By 1781, the war reached its final act. British General Cornwallis, confident in his position, fortified Yorktown, Virginia. What he did not anticipate was the trap closing around him. American and French forces converged on land. The French Navy blocked escape by sea. For weeks, artillery thundered. Then, silence. Cornwallis surrendered. The war was effectively over. When the Treaty of Paris was signed in 1783, Britain recognized the independence of the United States. The impossible had happened. But now came the harder question: what kind of nation would this be? The Articles of Confederation, written during wartime, proved weak and ineffective. The central government lacked power to tax, regulate trade, or enforce laws. States argued, economies faltered, rebellion brewed. In 1786, farmers in Massachusetts rose up against debt and foreclosure in what became known as Shays' Rebellion. It terrified the nation's leaders. They had overthrown tyranny only to risk chaos. Something had to change. In 1787, delegates gathered in Philadelphia, officially to revise the Articles. Unofficially, they came to rewrite the future. The Constitutional Convention was tense and secretive. Windows were shut, guards posted, arguments were fierce. Large states wanted representation based on population. Small states demanded equality. Northern states challenged slavery. Southern states defended it as essential to their economy. Compromise followed compromise. The result was a constitution that balanced power but avoided hard truths. Slavery was not abolished. Native Americans were ignored. Women were excluded entirely. The document spoke of liberty while leaving millions outside its promise. Still, it created something revolutionary, a government based on law, not bloodline, a system of checks and balances, a nation where power was divided, limited, and, at least in theory, accountable. Ratification was not guaranteed. Critics feared tyranny in a new form. Supporters, writing under the name Publius, published essays that would become known as the Federalist Papers. In the end, the Constitution was adopted, but only with a promise, a Bill of Rights. 10 amendments guaranteeing freedoms of speech, religion, press, assembly, and due process. For the first time, a nation defined itself not by a king, but by rights. George Washington became the first president, setting precedents that would echo for centuries. He stepped down after 2 terms, rejecting monarchy and personal power. It was a quiet act of immense importance. The United States had been born in war. Now it faced the challenge of peace. A fragile republic surrounded by enemies, divided by ideology, burdened by contradictions. And beneath it all, one unresolved truth remained, one that would grow, fester, and eventually explode. A nation built on freedom was still holding millions in bondage. That contradiction would not remain buried forever. It was already shaping the future.
The new nation stood upright, but it did not stand united. Beneath the celebrations and ceremonies, beneath the speeches about liberty and republican virtue, America was already splitting along invisible fault lines. The revolution had answered one question, who would rule, but it had left many others dangerously unresolved. What did freedom actually mean? For white landowning men, it meant opportunity, voice, and power. For women, it meant obedience cloaked in praise. For Native Americans, it meant continued displacement. And for enslaved Africans, it meant that the language of liberty would echo around them without ever reaching their chains. The first presidents understood how fragile the experiment was. Washington warned against political parties, fearing they would divide the nation. His warning went unheeded almost immediately. Alexander Hamilton believed in a strong central government, a national bank, and close ties with Britain. Thomas Jefferson envisioned a republic of farmers, suspicious of centralized power and sympathetic to revolutionary France. Their disagreement was not personal, it was philosophical, and it hardened into America's first political divide. By the turn of the 19th century, political parties had formed. Newspapers became weapons, loyalty was questioned, accusations of tyranny and betrayal filled the public sphere. Yet even as Americans argued about power, they were pushing relentlessly westward. Land was freedom, land was wealth, land was destiny. The Louisiana Purchase of 1803 doubled the size of the nation overnight. Thomas Jefferson, who had long argued for a limited federal government, now stretched constitutional interpretation to its breaking point. He did it because he understood something vital. If America did not expand, someone else would. The land beyond the Mississippi was vast, fertile, and already inhabited. Native nations had lived there for generations, with complex societies, trade networks, and spiritual ties to the land. None of that mattered. To American settlers, westward expansion was opportunity ordained by history itself. Later, it would be given a name, manifest destiny, but the belief existed long before the words. Treaties were signed, broken, rewritten, and ignored.
Tribes were pressured, deceived, and forced into submission. Violence followed inevitability. The War of 1812 briefly united the nation against Britain once more, but it also reinforced a growing sense of American identity. When the war ended without clear victory or defeat, Americans declared triumph anyway. National pride surged. Factories multiplied. Roads stretched outward. Steamboats transformed rivers into highways of commerce. Cities grew. Immigration increased. And so did the demand for labor. Cotton became king in the South, powered by enslaved workers whose suffering made the nation wealthy. Eily Whitney's cotton gin, intended to reduce labor, did the opposite. It made slavery more profitable than ever. By the early 1800s, slavery was no longer just a moral question. It was an economic engine. Every new territory raised the same explosive issue. Would it be free or slave? Compromises postponed conflict, but never resolved it. The Missouri Compromise drew lines across the map and across the future. The nation pretended geography could contain injustice. It could not. Meanwhile, Native American nations faced relentless pressure. President Andrew Jackson, a hero to many white Americans, viewed Native tribes as obstacles to progress. In 1830, the Indian Removal Act became law. It authorized the forced relocation of tens of thousands of Native Americans from their ancestral lands east of the Mississippi to territory in the West. The Cherokee fought the law in court and won. The Supreme Court ruled in their favor. Jackson ignored it. What followed was the Trail of Tears, a march of suffering, disease, and death. Families were driven from their homes. Thousands died along the way. The nation expanded, its conscience shrank. As the 1840s approached, America surged westward again, into Texas, into California, into lands claimed by Mexico. War followed ambition. The Mexican-American War delivered vast new territories to the United States and reopened the question that would not stay silent. Would slavery expand with the nation? The debate grew louder. Abolitionists spoke with increasing urgency. Enslaved people resisted in countless ways: escape, rebellion, endurance. The Underground Railroad carried whispers of freedom northward. Figures like Frederick Douglass forced America to confront itself, asking how a nation built on liberty could tolerate bondage. The answer, increasingly, was that it could not. Yet compromise after compromise delayed the inevitable reckoning. The Compromise of 1850, the Fugitive Slave Act, the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Each attempt to preserve unity only deepened division. Violence erupted in Kansas. Senators brawled on the floor of Congress. Trust dissolved. By the time Abraham Lincoln rose to national prominence, the nation was no longer arguing about policy. It was arguing about existence. Could the United States survive half free and half slave? Lincoln believed slavery was morally wrong, but he also believed the Union must be preserved at all costs. His election in 1860 was the breaking point. Southern states did not wait. They seceded. One by one, they declared that the Union no longer represented them. They formed a new nation, built explicitly on the preservation of slavery. America stood on the edge of its greatest crisis. The contradictions it had carried since its birth, freedom and bondage, unity and division, were about to collide. And this time, compromise would not save it. Only war would decide what the United States truly was.
The war did not begin with thunder. It began with a choice. In April 1861, Confederate forces fired on Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor. The bombardment was brief. Casualties were few, but the meaning was unmistakable. The Union had been challenged.
Abraham Lincoln called for volunteers. The response was overwhelming. Men on both sides believed the war would be short. They believed courage and righteousness would decide the outcome quickly. They were wrong. The Civil War would become the bloodiest conflict in American history, claiming more lives than all other U.S. wars combined. Brother fought brother. Neighbor fought neighbor. The nation tore itself apart. Early victories favored the Confederacy. Their generals were experienced, their soldiers highly motivated, defending land they called home. The Union, larger and better supplied, struggled to coordinate its strength. Lincoln faced impossible pressures. Abolitionists demanded immediate emancipation. Border states threatened defection. Military defeats eroded public confidence. But Lincoln understood something few others did. This war could not be won without transforming its purpose. In 1863, after the devastating Battle of Antietam, he issued the Emancipation Proclamation. It did not free all enslaved people, but it redefined the war. No longer was it only about preserving the Union. It was now about freedom. Enslaved people fled plantations, crossed battle lines, and joined Union forces. Black soldiers, once excluded, fought bravely for a nation that had yet to fully accept them. Their service would change the war and the meaning of citizenship. The conflict intensified. Battles like Gettysburg and Vicksburg turned the tide in the Union's favor. General Ulysses S. Grant embraced relentless warfare, understanding that victory required breaking the Confederacy's ability to fight. The cost was staggering. Cities burned, fields turned to graveyards, hospitals overflowed with amputees and dying men. Civilians suffered starvation and fear. By 1865, the Confederacy was collapsing. At Appomattox Courthouse, General R.E. Lee surrendered to Grant. The war was over. The Union was preserved. Slavery was dead. But peace would prove far more complicated than victory. Days later, Abraham Lincoln was assassinated. The nation mourned the loss of a leader who had guided it through its darkest hour. Reconstruction began under a cloud of grief and uncertainty. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery. The 14th granted citizenship and equal protection. The 15th sought to protect voting rights. For a brief moment, a different America seemed possible. Formerly enslaved people voted, held office, built schools, and shaped their futures. Black communities flourished despite poverty and resistance. But hope met backlash. White supremacist groups formed. Violence surged. Laws were twisted to undermine freedom. Federal commitment wavered. By 1877, Reconstruction was effectively over. Southern states imposed segregation, disenfranchisement, and terror. Jim Crow laws hardened inequality into daily life. Lynchings enforced racial order through fear. The promises of the Civil War remained unfulfilled. Yet America did not pause. Railroads stitched the continent together. Industry exploded. Immigrants arrived in waves, drawn by opportunity and trapped by exploitation. Factories roared, cities rose, fortunes were made overnight and lost just as quickly. The Gilded Age dazzled and deceived. Wealth concentrated in the hands of a few, while workers labored in brutal conditions. Child labor was common, safety was rare. Strikes erupted. Protesters were beaten, some were killed. The question of power resurfaced. Who controlled America, the people or capital? Reformers pushed back. Journalists exposed corruption. Labor unions organized. Progressivism emerged, seeking to curb excess and protect the vulnerable. Slowly, unevenly, change came. Yet beneath progress lay tension. The nation had healed only on the surface. The wounds of race, class, and identity still festered. And the world beyond America's borders was shifting. Empires clashed, technology accelerated, old alliances strained. America, once isolated, was being pulled toward the center of global events. Soon it would face a new kind of test, not one that threatened to split it apart, but one that would force it to decide what kind of power it intended to be.
At the turn of the 20th century, the United States no longer saw itself as fragile. It saw itself as rising. Factories thundered day and night. Steel, oil, railroads, and electricity reshaped daily life. Cities grew upward and outward, crowded with immigrants who carried languages, customs, and dreams from every corner of the world. For many, America was a promise fulfilled. For others, it was a struggle that never seemed to end. The nation's confidence spilled beyond its borders. In 1898, war with Spain transformed the United States into an imperial power almost overnight. Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines came under American control. The country that had once rebelled against empire now wielded one. Some celebrated expansion as progress. Others warned it betrayed the nation's founding principles. The debate reflected a deeper question. Could a republic rule others without becoming what it once opposed? As America stepped onto the world stage, reform surged at home. Progressive leaders sought to rein in corporate power, improve working conditions, and expand democracy. Women organized relentlessly, demanding the right to vote. Their struggle was long, resisted, and often dismissed. But in 1920, the 19th Amendment became law. Women gained the vote. It was a victory generations in the making, and a reminder that American freedom had always been incomplete, expanding only when pushed. Then came the Great War. When World War I erupted in Europe in 1914, the United States stayed out at first. The conflict seemed distant, ancient rivalries exploding far from American shores. But economic ties, German submarine warfare, and a belief that American involvement could shape the peace pulled the nation in. In 1917, the United States entered the war. Millions of young men crossed the Atlantic, factories retooled, propaganda filled the air, dissent was suppressed, loyalty was demanded. The war ended in 1918 with victory and disillusionment. President Woodrow Wilson dreamed of a world made safe for democracy, anchored by a League of Nations. But at home, the Senate rejected his vision. America turned inward. The 1920s roared with excess and contradiction. Jazz filled the air, automobiles reshaped cities, stock markets soared. But beneath the celebration lay fragility. Racial violence erupted in cities across the country. Immigration was sharply restricted. Fear of communism fueled repression. Prosperity was uneven and unstable. In October 1929, the illusion collapsed. The stock market crashed. Banks failed. Businesses closed. Farms were foreclosed. Unemployment soared. Families lost everything. The Great Depression tested the nation in ways war never had. Desperation bred anger. Hunger bred despair. Faith in institutions crumbled. Then, in 1933, Franklin Roosevelt took office. He did not promise miracles. He promised action. The New Deal transformed the role of government, creating jobs, regulating markets, and providing relief. It did not end the Depression, but it restored hope. For many Americans, it marked the first time the federal government actively intervened to protect ordinary people. Yet even as America struggled to rebuild, storm clouds gathered abroad. Fascism rose in Europe, militarism surged in Asia, democracy trembled. Once again, the world moved toward war. The United States resisted involvement, haunted by memories of the last conflict, but events would not wait. On December 7, 1941, Japanese planes attacked Pearl Harbor.
The nation awoke united. World War II demanded total mobilization. Factories produced weapons at unprecedented scale. Women entered the workforce in massive numbers. Racial barriers shifted, though they did not disappear. American soldiers fought across Europe, Africa, and the Pacific. The war was brutal, global, and transformative. In 1945, after unimaginable destruction, the war ended. America emerged victorious and dominant. The United States now stood as one of two superpowers in a shattered world. But victory brought new responsibilities and new dangers. The question was no longer whether America would engage with the world. It was how, and whether it could wield power without losing its soul.
The war ended, but peace did not settle quietly. The world that emerged from the ashes of World War II was divided not by borders alone, but by ideology. Two visions of the future stood opposed, one rooted in liberal democracy and capitalism, the other in communism and centralized control. The United States and the Soviet Union, allies only by necessity, became rivals almost overnight. Thus began the Cold War. It was a conflict without formal declarations, fought through influence, espionage, propaganda, and proxy wars. Fear replaced unity. Suspicion seeped into daily life. At home, the threat of communism became an obsession. Loyalty oaths were demanded. Careers were destroyed by accusation. Senator Joseph McCarthy rose to power by promising to expose enemies within. In the name of security, freedom narrowed. Yet prosperity surged. The post-war economy boomed. Suburbs spread. Highways connected cities. Consumer goods filled homes. The American dream took physical form in lawns, cars, and televisions. But not everyone was invited. African Americans who had fought for freedom abroad returned to segregation at home. They faced discrimination in housing, education, employment, and justice. The contradiction could no longer be ignored. The civil rights movement rose from churches, colleges, and communities, led by figures who demanded not revolution, but fulfillment of America's own promises. Martin Luther King Jr. spoke of nonviolence and moral urgency. Rosa Parks refused to surrender her dignity. Students marched, sat in, and faced brutality with resolve. Change came slowly and at great cost. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 reshaped American law. Legal segregation ended. Barriers fell. But resistance remained fierce. As progress advanced at home, conflict deepened abroad. In Vietnam, the United States became entangled in a war it did not fully understand. What began as containment escalated into catastrophe. American soldiers fought in jungles far from home. Television brought the war into living rooms. Protests erupted. Trust in government eroded. A generation questioned authority, tradition, and purpose. In 1968, the nation shattered. Martin Luther King was assassinated. Robert Kennedy followed. Cities burned. Hope seemed to vanish. Yet, even in crisis, America continued to change. Women demanded equality. Environmentalism emerged. The Supreme Court expanded rights. Culture transformed. Then came Watergate. The revelation that a president had abused power shook the nation to its core. Richard Nixon resigned in disgrace. Faith in leadership collapsed, but the system endured. The Cold War dragged on. Nuclear fear hovered. Proxy wars flared across the globe. Finally, in 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed. The United States stood alone. For a brief moment, it seemed history had chosen a winner.
But history is never finished. A new century arrived with new challenges: terrorism, globalization, inequality, and technological revolution. On September 11, 2001, the illusion of safety shattered once more. The nation united in grief and anger. Wars followed. Surveillance expanded. Fear reshaped policy. America entered the 21st century powerful, divided, and uncertain. The questions that had haunted it since birth remained. Who belongs? Who is protected? What is freedom worth? The story of the United States is not a tale of perfection. It is a struggle, unfinished, contested, and alive. A nation forever becoming what it promised to be. And the test continues.
The war ended, but peace did not settle quietly. The world that emerged from the ashes of World War II was divided not by borders alone, but by ideology. Two visions of the future stood opposed, one rooted in liberal democracy and capitalism, the other in communism and centralized control. The United States and the Soviet Union, allies only by necessity, became rivals almost overnight. Thus began the Cold War. It was a conflict without formal declarations, fought through influence, espionage, propaganda, and proxy wars. Fear replaced unity. Suspicion seeped into daily life. At home, the threat of communism became an obsession. Loyalty oaths were demanded. Careers were destroyed by accusation. Senator Joseph McCarthy rose to power by promising to expose enemies within. In the name of security, freedom narrowed. Yet prosperity surged. The post-war economy boomed, suburbs spread, highways connected cities, consumer goods filled homes. The American dream took physical form in lawns, cars, and televisions. But not everyone was invited. African Americans who had fought for freedom abroad returned to segregation at home. They faced discrimination in housing, education, employment, and justice. The contradiction could no longer be ignored. The civil rights movement rose from churches, colleges, and communities, led by figures who demanded not revolution, but fulfillment of America's own promises. Martin Luther King Jr. spoke of nonviolence and moral urgency. Rosa Parks refused to surrender her dignity. Students marched, sat in, and faced brutality with resolve. Change came slowly and at great cost. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 reshaped American law. Legal segregation ended, barriers fell, but resistance remained fierce. As progress advanced at home, conflict deepened abroad. In Vietnam, the United States became entangled in a war it did not fully understand. What began as containment escalated into catastrophe. American soldiers fought in jungles far from home. Television brought the war into living rooms. Protests erupted. Trust in government eroded. A generation questioned authority, tradition, and purpose. In 1968, the nation shattered. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. Robert Kennedy followed. Cities burned. Hope seemed to vanish. Yet even in crisis, America continued to change. Women demanded equality. Environmentalism emerged. The Supreme Court expanded rights. Culture transformed. Then came Watergate. The revelation that a president had abused power shook the nation to its core. Richard Nixon resigned in disgrace. Faith in leadership collapsed, but the system endured. The Cold War dragged on. Nuclear fear hovered over the globe. Proxy wars flared across the globe. Finally, in 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed. The United States stood alone.
For a brief moment, it seemed history had chosen a winner. But history is never finished. A new century arrived with new challenges: terrorism, globalization, inequality, and technological revolution. On September 11, 2001, the illusion of safety shattered once more. The nation united in grief and anger. Wars followed, surveillance expanded, fear reshaped policy. America entered the 21st century powerful, divided, and uncertain. The questions that had haunted it since birth remained. Who belongs? Who is protected? What is freedom worth? The story of the United States is not a tale of perfection. It is a struggle, unfinished, contested, and alive. A nation forever becoming what it promised to be. And the test continues.